Retro Quickies, Adventures of Rad Gravity.
This is one of the reasons why I like to dive deep into libraries of older consoles like this, because yeah, there are plenty of great and popular titles that have been making the rounds for years and years, and there are plenty of hidden gems that aren't really so hidden anymore. But just as often, there are plenty of games that remain hidden from plain sight that you don't really hear a lot of folks talking about. Sure, they may have their fans, other folks might know about them, but when you're talking about retro games, the name doesn't really come up. The Adventures of Rad Gravity, I think, fits into that group very nicely. It wasn't a name that I've heard come up in conversation or any videos discussing NES games of any kind. There is media out there about it, but it's not that forward-facing. So here's another video that'll end up just like that. Rad Gravity was a somewhat late release for the NES, being put out in 1990, published by Activision, and developed by Interplay? Well, damn, that's kind of interesting. Interplay is a company most well known for Earthworm Jim, but they made a ton of games all throughout their existence. While the name is still being used today, the original company folded in pretty spectacular fashion back in 2004, and the Interplay of today is basically just a shell focused on re-releasing or remastering whatever the company has the rights to currently. But, well before that, they were releasing tons of games that tended to just chill in the background and never really managed to break out into the mainstream, like Adventures of Rad Gravity. The game is a sci-fi adventure platformer game, with some fairly interesting gimmicks thrown in here and there. While the story itself isn't really spelled out at the start of the game for you, I was curious enough of what was happening at the beginning that I hunted down a scan of the game's manual, and I was rather surprised to find that there was a lot of effort put into this, as the story in the manual is laid out in a little mini-comic. Apologies for the poor quality, this was literally the best quality scan I could find for this thing. In the far future, humanity created a new form of biomechanical life called the Concubines, a handful of super smart and powerful living computers. However, the villain of the game, a human who for some reason decided to turn himself into a living brain, has shut down and hid the Concubines all over the solar system, and without them to stop him, is currently attempting to conquer all of humankind's colonized worlds. One of the Concubines has been recovered by the Space Rangers, however, named Kakos, and teams up with their most promising cadet, the one and only Rad Gravity, in a bid to find the other Concubines and stop the living brain before he can become the tyrant of the entire galaxy. I'd say that's a fairly good setup for the ongoing plot. The game starts off with you having to go through a few linear stages in order to get some of the basics down about the game. They give you a good idea of how the platforming and combat in the game is going to go, how exploration works, and how you can find new tools and upgrades for your health as you explore. It's a pretty well done opening, and after finding all of the transporter codes available and dealing with a chase sequence to get Kakos back, the game opens up considerably, allowing you to go and explore several different planets all at once. Some of them you can't do much on the first time you visit, but this is where the adventure game aspect takes place. You'll inevitably run into obstacles to deal with and people to talk to who need help solving their problems, and by doing so, you'll get more pathways opened up, leading you to actually being able to make progress. The game is surprisingly good about giving you an idea of where to go and what to do, though there are times where the NPC dialogue can be a bit vague, like here on Turvia. The mayor of this town wants us to find the stolen gravity engine so that he can fix the gravitational anomaly that's pulling his town apart. But that doesn't really give you any indication of where we should start looking, or even if it's still here on the planet. That doesn't happen very often though, and it at least gives you a goal to strive for. What seems to happen more often is the fact that the game doesn't make it clear what the rules are for transporting items. Tools will just be automatically added to your inventory, but larger objects need to be carried, and the game does a poor job of communicating when you just need to teleport back to the ship with something, or when you actually need to deliver it somewhere on planet. Which sucks, because if you happen to exit a screen without the item you were carrying before, it disappears and you have to go and find it again to have another chance at figuring out what to do with it. Despite this, actually getting around and moving from screen to screen can feel pretty rewarding. And it's a game that loves giving you those great aha moments when you finally discover what you're supposed to do and where to go. There's also a lot of charm in this sci-fi universe. While Kakos himself is pretty no-nonsense, I do like his design, and Rad himself, while he is presented as a confident, chatty chin man, there are times where a bit more personality shines through with him. I particularly love this idle stance he has, it cracks me up. He doesn't look like he knows what to do with himself right now. Every planet also does pretty good at conveying personality too, if only through its aesthetics. You have places like Saria, a planet stuck in the Jurassic era with dinosaurs running around everywhere, or Siberia, a planet with a ton of advanced technology. But there are other planets with actual gimmicks attached as well, the big one being Turvia, a planet where unstable gravity has you walking upside down and along the ceiling most of the time. It's disorienting, but other than up and down being swapped, it's nothing you can't get used to, and honestly, it's kind of a fun gimmick as far as the game goes. The game even has some nice narrative touches put into its gameplay. That part of the game where you have to rescue Kakos, for example. You're warned that the kidnappers are planning to turn him into an evil robot. If you fail to stop the factory line he's placed in before he reaches the end of it, that actually happens. I don't know if you can actually beat him because he wrecked me immediately, but that's honestly a nice touch. It's essentially an optional fail state for this level. I like that kind of detail, even if it did mean I had to go back through a rather frustrating platforming area to get back here. That seems like a good transition into talking about the actual gameplay, which is a little bit mixed. Most of the time it feels fine, but Rad moves with a lot of momentum in his step, to the point where if you start moving and then naturally let him come to a stop, he'll take several big steps forward before finally slowing down. This also applies to his jump arc as well. You have some control over its trajectory, but depending on how fast you are moving and how committed to one direction you are, it can make precision very difficult, especially on more narrow pathways. This section here, near the beginning of the game, where I was in the middle of the chase to rescue Kakos, was particularly annoying because the momentum constantly caused me to overshoot my jump, or I overcorrected and ended up undershooting it, or just walking off the side of the platform after successfully landing. This is a pretty constant problem with the game's platforming, sorry to say. When you're in areas where dropping down a pit or into a lake of lava isn't a concern, it's not nearly that big of an issue, and the game doesn't often put a lot of instant kill pits in your way, or at least it doesn't make them so daunting to cross. But in areas where you do have those sorts of obstacles, it can be exceedingly frustrating to get across, especially with the game's continue system. Okay, the fact that you essentially have unlimited lives is a good thing. However, dying at any point will return you to your ship, essentially the level select, and you basically have to start over from scratch in whatever area you were in, or go off and try a different area. I'm glad I don't have to worry about starting the entire game over from the beginning at any point, but at the same time, some of the challenges in these areas are fairly long, even after you figure out what you're supposed to do, and it can be really frustrating to get deep into a new area only to basically have to start over. Not nearly as bad as it could have been for a game of this age, but with some of these areas, it feels like it's more trouble than it's worth. You also have a communicator, which will beam you back to your ship, but the only big difference between using that and death is that the communicator lets you take carried objects with you, while death seems to be the only way to get the continue password. Inventory is also something you have to think about, kind of. When you get a new tool, it will automatically be added to your menu, which you can change to from the pause menu. You start out with only your trusty laser sword and your communicator, but it doesn't take long before you pick up a laser pistol, and later on, you can find a crystal bomb to lob at enemies and obstacles as well. You can also find upgrades for these too, to increase their attack power or give them new properties, but not all of these upgrades are entirely helpful. Like with the laser pistol, for example. When you first get it, you can only fire directly in front of you, but you can also fire it straight ahead while you're crouching. But after you get the upgrade for it on Turvia, it can shoot straight up and straight down, which is cool, but it also shoots down when you're crouching. Basically meaning that the only way to attack enemies that are low to the ground now is to switch out your laser sword, which is definitely less than ideal. It's a bit of a bizarre alteration that really hamstrings combat. Speaking of combat, it is thankfully very simple. You either shoot things with your laser, hit them with your bombs, or hit them with your sword until they blow up. Once you have the laser pistol and the ability to shoot upwards, that'll most likely be your main way of dealing with most threats, though you will occasionally have to switch out to other weapons to deal with enemies that you can't hit with the gun, like those tiny ants over on Saria. However, fighting head-on is generally a pretty poor idea, as once you get past the basic enemies on places like Siberia, enemies start to get tougher to deal with in some weird ways that leads to some interesting encounters, like these giant mechs that you fight while trying to get the teleporter coordinates. Sure, you have the pistol by now, but you can also get them to shoot each other, and that's pretty cool. These blob enemies are invincible until they latch onto your head, and afterwards you have to bang your head against something to defeat them. The game is full of weird and interesting interactions like this, though most combat just boils down to keeping your distance and shooting at them from afar. Now, I'm not much of a music guy. I can't really express how best to talk about why a piece of music is good or bad, but I feel confident in saying that Rad Gravity has one of the most confused soundtracks I have ever heard. Like, some of the music is just almost close to being okay, but it feels like the people playing the music couldn't agree on what each instrument was supposed to be doing. And so it sounds clumsy, haphazard, mismatched. It sounds weird. Just listen to the title screen music for a moment. See, I'm not crazy, right? There's kind of a good song in there, but it sounds like it's constantly stepping all over itself. It's almost like self-sabotage. Well, at least it looks pretty good, as I pointed out before. Most late-stage NES games tended to look really impressive for the hardware. The sprites aren't huge, but they are very expressive, and there's a pretty good variety of designs here. And when you see Kakos and Rad in the ship itself, it's pretty cool seeing their designs in such huge detail like that. Overall, I'm kinda surprised that the Adventures of Rad Gravity isn't more well known. It's a bit rough around the edges, this is true, but it's got a lot of good ideas and it's pretty fun to play, and it's focused more on exploration and puzzle solving, rather than dashing through all the various levels just to get to the end, makes it a little intriguing. So yeah, it's a fun game that you've probably never heard of before. You're welcome.